to the Talk Diaries. For the first time in modern history, we are finding that Europe's three main economies, that is Germany, France and Britain, are simultaneously in the polls being led by far-right or populist parties. So in this episode of the Talk Diaries, we want to talk about specifically the UK and what the traditional parties, Labour and for that matter the Conservatives, can do about the fact that they are being outranked simply in the polls. What levers are available to them? Well, with me, Gitto Harry and Paul Mason. Welcome to you both. Gitto is former Director of Communications to Downing Street under Boris Johnson and also spent just about 2 decades at the BBC, which is where I met him. And Paul Mason, I also met at the BBC, author, columnist, author of several books, economics editor for the BBC programme Newsnight, and has also worked for Channel 4 News and been an advisor to the Labour Party. Right, let's
Welcome.
start. Hi. So we see, for the perspective, let's start with the Tories because they are slightly missing in action here, Gitto. What can they do? Where are they in the polls, in a parlous state, obviously, and what can they do about the fact that Reform, who we're going to describe for these purposes are on the far right, are leading in the polls, about 35%?
Yeah, frankly, they're nowhere of any consequence in the polls, and they're nowhere of any consequence in the political debate at the moment. And this time next year, that may have congealed in a way that is probably fatal for the current leader, because if they perform like this in important elections for the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senate next year, then the midterm knockback will be cast. And that will be pretty devastating. And so there are genuine concerns, I think, that one of the most successful parties in the history of Western democracy is facing an existential threat without a major overhaul in all kinds of things. And so it's, for better or worse, some people may find that comforting. I think it's a bad thing for democracy in general, and certainly bad for the Conservative Party in general, that their position has been taken over by Reform, who, having eaten the Conservatives, breakfast and hearty lunch, are now off to eat Labour's dinner. And I think that's on the cards as the next step.
So the Tories really fell out of popularity, and we can get into why, and specifically what the events were that led to that. But the fact is, Reform is in their territory, as you rightly say. If we come over to Labour, the challenge is very different, isn't it, Paul? And presumably part of it is the fact that much of the Labour Party is not interested in engaging in the challenge that Reform is presenting. It wants to present an entirely different narrative.
Well, I think both main parties are finding out that actions have consequences. One of the great delusions of the technocratic era is, well, we can make mistakes and then we can sort them out. I think that was almost like the sort of illusion that underpinned the Johnson, but particularly the Truss and Sunak governments. And I think it's something that's coming to bite Labour. All main parties are facing a twin problem: the disintegration of the international order, which is draining their attention because you have to be on the case with Trump, you have to be on the case with Putin, because these are matters of national security. There's nothing more important than slipping the ball on that. But then there's the issue of, let's look at it at its meta level. The European Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, the global markets, which are punishing the Labour government at the moment, and indeed all the three governments you started by mentioning, these are extraterrestrial forces. And governments are finding you can't do much. You don't have much leeway. Meanwhile, beneath, you've got a population that's just really fed up with the stagnation of wages, fed up with the quality of public services. And what's happened recently is that migration has become the dramatizer of all those issues. So whether you're talking about the kind of legitimate, economic, high-skilled Indian software programmer, or whether you're talking about someone who is a young man who's come on a boat who may or may not have the right to asylum, in the public's mind, these are all drains on resources, competition for resources in a country that isn't growing, and they're thinking, well, why are we doing any of it? And
the unfortunate fact is that all governments are constrained by the international system. And so that we can come to how unfortunate a series of missteps Labour has taken. But I do think that I would also be sorry to see the Tories go down the drain, but I think that together, the kind of political class that believes in democracy and that also believes in these unwritten rules that we play by, because you could see at the Reforms Conference that they quite clearly don't. We need to come together and try and sort of bolster the resilience of democracy before we start fighting each other or indeed crowing over each other's demise.
Coming to the Tories, Gitto, I said that they seem to have gone into irrelevance. You would have thought that given that there is significant overlap on this migration issue between them and Reform, that wouldn't have been the case. So why is it that people are so down on the Tories? What specific missteps do you think led to that situation?
I think if you decide that the single most important thing is to stop, foreigners coming here on small boats or through, other means, and that the country, you slide from that legitimate concern to let's say, a more alarming kind of sense that there are too many people in this country now for us to be who we are, and therefore that Britain as we know it is being changed, you start to get to that world where you think of anyone who is, slightly different looking or sounding to you as sort of alien. And that's the world that Reform, and I choose my words carefully because I don't think that Nigel Farage is a racist, but they certainly play to that mood music, if you like. Now, if you want that, do you want to hear that message? Because that's where the Conservative Party are parked at the moment, as a sort of Reform light. Do you want that message from, a black woman from Nigeria who came here as a teenager called Kemi Badenoch? Or do you want it from the man down the pub, Nigel Farage, all jolly, telling you, this country is not what it was when I grew up? The answer to that is pretty simple. Whereas for me, the Conservatives have always come back because on the whole, they have been pragmatic. They've been not ideological. They have been ruthless. They have focused on you cannot spend a penny on behalf of the public, whatever you choose to spend it on, without raising that money, without actually taxing people sensibly, but allowing people to grow the economy. And I think there's a great big glaring gap pretty much at the centre of British politics where Tony Blair would be comfortable, David Cameron would be comfortable, Boris Johnson would be comfortable, once again advocating that. And what we may see with Reform, which is again an opportunity perhaps for the Conservatives if it stops following and starts to regain its own sense of purpose, is Reform will get into an auction with Labour to sort of offer more in benefits for people who are not working in places like the South Wales Valleys, where the election next year for the Welsh Senedd will be won or lost. And so I sense an opportunity for the Conservatives, but the current leadership and the current stance of the party is not open to that.
Right. Oh, and if we look at Labour in particular, I mentioned this divide within the party, Paul, as to people who want to stay true to the values of Labour as they see it, and those who are trying to pick up what you're describing, Gitto, as the mood music. And there are moves clearly from Labour to deal with migration, but it might be too little too late. And also, it is hugely constrained, as any government would be, in terms of finances.
Well, I think let's park the finances issue somewhere for a minute. The issue of Reform's rise, I think Reform's poll lead is brittle because it came from nowhere. It can go nowhere, back to somewhere, as it were, a smaller proportion. And you can see one of the things that you, as someone who writes about the history of far right and right wing populist parties, is that they are picking on a radicalized mood, or are they picking up a kind of process of radicalization that has to go somewhere? This is why they've created the mythology that there's going to be an early election. There's not going to be an early election. No, in no circumstance. So they're kind of getting people revved up as if they're going to come to power. And if you're on the internet, you watch people say, why isn't the election tomorrow? Well, that mood can't sustain itself. So that's one thing that Labour can do. It has time to deliver. But what it has to deliver, the mistake of the first year, has been trying to deliver long-term things that are good, but people can't feel the benefit. They've got to switch completely to short-term delivery, actually putting money in people's pockets. They did this in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when we were covering it together, Tanya. If you remember, Peter Mandelson, car scrappage scheme. finger snapped, cars begin to roll off the production line. On the migration issue, what I think with the installation of Shabana Mahmood at the Home Office, I think we're going to see certainly a toughening of the not just I wouldn't say rhetoric, the rationale. People like me, I'm on the left of the Labour Party, but I can see perfectly well the social injustice of bringing 1.1 million people in a single year, perfectly legitimately. No one has a problem with them. The problem is that that's created competition in the labour market, competition for school places, competition for housing, that people are right to ask, well, who asked me? Where did anybody ask me? Likewise, if I support the principle of the Refugee Convention of asylum for those who have a legitimate fear of persecution at home, I must also support the deportation of people who don't pass that test. And that's something that Labour Party have been very queasy about. It's going to have to get very serious about, because I think the means are arriving to indeed smash the gangs. It is happening slowly. I'm told that it's the clever ones who are still operating. The ones that had lax security have been busted. There's been a couple of high-profile cases. I think slowly putting into place the choking off the supply, as it were, and taking more of control over who can and who can't claim asylum. The other side of it, again, people involved with this, and something I think Labour are aware of now, is switch off the demand. That is, the demand for irregular migration is driven partly by our very, very lax labour market. And that you've seen Keir Starmer, you've seen Pat McFadden now float the idea of digital identity cards, something I support. If Labour is brave enough to make that one of their gambits to the electorate, I think that'll be interesting, because that'll split the right. The libertarian right will be against it.
Also, Paul, it's very, very visible. What you talk about in terms of the boats is in terms of really the numbers, is a very small part of the problem. But the images are very strong. And I think the images, therefore, maybe are what people are looking for right now. So, Gito, if we turn to you and talk about this brittle nature of the lead of reform in the polls, there is time before the next election for Labour or indeed the Tories to come up with some pretty solid ideas here. But reform presumably doesn't have the depth of experience really to put anything concrete on the table and well-rounded in terms of what it would do, for example, with the economy and other things. At the moment, it's all very, very conceptual, isn't it? And the other thing that's interesting from the perspective of both parties, I want you to answer both of these questions, is nowhere does anybody appear to be looking at Farage and saying, look, part of the problem in the so-called Boris wave of immigration resulted from Brexit, or at least it came after Brexit, and there was a reason for it. And also, by the way, you're hanging out with Putin, and you seem to like Trump a lot. Let's look at what those leaders are doing. So there isn't any pushback, is what I'm saying. That's the heading, Gito.
Yeah, there are, questions for Farage, and he can expect more scrutiny going forwards. But the danger at the moment, just as I don't think Labour won the last election, the Conservatives basically surrendered it, that Keir Starmer does the same. He basically loses the next election, and the Conservatives are not in a position to take advantage of that. And Nigel Farage wins by default. That's I think, the trajectory we're on now. And I thought that the Labour government was actually self-snookered, if that's doable. Yes, you can snooker yourself, can't you? But there's the sort of the unwelcome, forced reshuffle last week in a funny sort of way has provided an opportunity, because the two issues that were going to destroy Labour and leave it without any hope at the next election, not to mention the damage to the country in the meantime, was that they had bottled welfare reform and they had basically nothing substantial to offer on immigration. And now we have a genuinely tough woman, a woman, who actually can openly say that she believes in chemical castration for rapists, as the Home Office, as the Home Secretary in Shabana Mahmood. So that could change the dynamics. If that doesn't, nothing will. And likewise, we have a hugely able, though understated man, Pat McFadden, being basically asked, though they don't sell it like this, but he's basically been asked to go and have another crack at some sort of way of reducing the welfare benefits without, presenting it in a way that Labour MPs find unpalatable. Now, if the two of them deliver, it's a lot of weight on two people's shoulders, but they are, Paul will know better than me, they are pretty regarded as pretty exceptional in Labour circles. Then there is hope for the government and there is hope for the country. And in terms of somebody who doesn't support Labour in general but wants Britain to be well run, I wish them well, power to their elbows. If they don't, then it really is all over. And Farage won't have to win the next election, persuasively. He'll just have to be there and he'll win by default.
Paul, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, but also this question of welfare. We know the figures suggest that there are simply too many people out of work right now, and people need to get back into work. And this is something that Farage has said, that this is part of the social injustice that you're describing. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because, if you are cutting, there is a demographic challenge here. We do, if we cut down on migration, we very definitely need to make sure that people are getting out to work.
The welfare crisis is something that it's the kind of boiling frog. It's happened slowly, but the projections are just very dramatic. That if we go on adding people to the out of work roll like we are, mainly for reasons of inability to work, often to do with mental health or mental disability, it will just bankrupt the country. I often hear protesters shout welfare, not warfare. But what they should be really shouting is welfare, not healthcare, because there's only two big ticket items in the public spending. Defence is smaller than debt repayment, debt interest. It's welfare and healthcare. And healthcare, you can shrink the costs, and I think West Streeting's doing a decent job of applying new technology, high productivity in healthcare. That's been the holy grail of many governments. But you cannot shrink welfare costs through productivity or technology. They're just, once people are in that role, they're there. Now, the causes are legion, but the obvious answer, and Labour is saying this, is to get people back to work. That needs a lot of support. It means it will often mean working from home. But at the moment, the problem is the benefit system. To put it frankly, it incentivizes being disabled rather than out of work. And there are even websites that tell you how to talk your way through the interview. Now, I'm sure that 9/10 of people who are claiming disability benefits are absolute, and probably more than 9/10 are absolutely legitimate. But again, with them, you've got to try and say, well, are there ways we could get you into work? Because the simple fact is, I'm a socialist, but Nye Bevan once said, socialism is the language of priorities. The language of priorities is the religion of socialism, and you can't have a situation where there's an unlimited, as it were, an unlimited pot of money for welfare, but not an unlimited pot of money for healthcare or for defence or for schools. There are, after all, shortages in healthcare, huge shortages in the NHS. That's why we have waiting lists. You try and manage them down, but ultimately there they are. What you can't say is there can be no constraints on welfare. So Pat McFadden has got his work cut out, and the problem I see within my own party is that, and Rachel Reeves will often say this, and I'm with her on this, if not on everything else, we are the Labour Party. The clue is in the name, a party of workers. A lot of people in the Labour Party, MPs, councillors, they spend a lot of time dealing with people who are out of work, and they become very exposed to their problems, which are real problems. But the language of all politics is making choices. And what you saw in that Labour welfare rebellion, unfortunate though the way it was handled was, I think it was handled incompetently, but at root, you got people in Parliament who had never thought through making big choices about things that they actually like. Healthcare, welfare, education. These are the choices. It's not welfare versus defence or welfare versus tax the rich. So my party needs to grow up in power. Not being in power for how many, 14 years is part of the problem. People come into politics, get quite high up into politics without ever having to make a big decision. So I want to make that decision and then sell it to people. Because as you say, Gito, just let me say this, as you say, there is this problem that Farage is now mobilising people on benefits and people who are on welfare, could, together with the pensioners, could form quite an important bloc if they simply decide to defend their right to have an unlimited pot of money. That's a common problem in many advanced societies, and we need to start addressing it.
And Gito, I mean, the Tories would have to address that too, wouldn't they?
Yes, and it's a source of regret that some of these problems escalated when the Conservatives were in power. And all I would say in mitigation, it's not a total excuse, but in mitigation, there were very few voices, particularly on the left, arguing against what cost us £400 billion, which was the bill for locking people up during COVID and paying people for not going to work. That did enormous damage. It was a massive price tag that had to be paid at some point, which explains why taxes went up. And it was a massive dent in growth, and it left, waiting lists for all kinds of things in the courts as well as in the NHS, worse than ever. Then there was a war in Europe, which initially its impact was even worse on us than it is now, which sent energy prices spiraling. So there were exceptional circumstances in a nutshell for that happening. Then you had the sort of massively unfortunate episode, to put it lightly, of Liz Truss. But the sobering thing is that the calculations of the money markets and the analysts at the moment are not that dissimilar as to the scale of expenditure and borrowing that is happening under Rachel Reeves as it was under Liz Truss. It's less dramatic, didn't happen in an afternoon. She's lasted more than, a lettuce. But we're in a similar position, and that is not sustainable. And Paul is absolutely right. Traditionally, politics was about where your priorities are, spending an amount of money that is sustainably takeable from a growing economy. And Conservatives and Labour would spend it slightly differently. But there was a working assumption for many decades, which was a healthy one for Britain, that you had to generate economic growth first and tax people at a level that didn't crush that economic growth and tax them in a sensible way. And then when you look at your priorities, if we were starting from scratch, would anyone think, hands up, who thinks that the top priority for modern Britain is welfare? Who thinks the second top priority is interest on debt? Who thinks that the eighth priority or wherever, because I think that's where it is in the pecking order, it's certainly in the lower half, is defence when Putin is on the rampage? Who thinks that students deserve less financial help from the government than pensioners who've had, the triple lock for a decade now? There are so many things that were introduced initially for good intentions, but they've become congealed, and the room for manoeuvre for successive governments has got so tiny that unless somebody's prepared to break the mould, we are just on a sort of inevitable road to decline.
Let me just look ahead then to the next election. As we've said, it's certainly not tomorrow, though Reform presumably would like it to be. Is there a positioning that the Labour Party or the Tories can take vis-a-vis Reform to push back, or is now not the time for that? And what is the best that the main parties can hope for? Would they have to swallow the possibility of a coalition, or would the Tories be more likely to go into coalition with Reform if it came to it than Labour? Paul?
Well, there's the intervening period. Make this a little bit of a theoretical discussion. The moment it looked like there could be an election which Farage could win, the markets wouldn't wait for a Liz Truss kind of phenomenon. Reform, I think, offered to spend 130 billion a year we haven't got at the last election. Though I think you'd see a market meltdown beforehand, and that itself would frame the game. I think I'm an advocate. I always have been an advocate of progressive alliances. I think Labour should be embracing rather than alienating the Green Party, Plaid Cymru, the Scots Nats. But there's too many tactical variables. What they need to do for the next 18 months is get their head down and do two things. One is deliver on welfare because the healthcare delivery story is good. The defence delivery story is spectacularly good, I would argue. It's welfare and then migration. If you can put migration to sleep a bit as an issue, because as I say, the anger that's going to be on the street, say this Saturday and next Saturday and whatever, it will dissipate because it has to go somewhere. Deliver on those two things. But the other thing is narrative. You'll know, Gutto, that's been your career. It's kind of, adjacent to my career. Labour's not got very many storytellers. And if I would say to the other side, the one thing that I think might change this, whereas if your old boss were to feel that he would that being out to pasture is boring him too much, and he might end up coming back. I can see that changing because he's a storyteller.
Interesting. Gitto, that is interesting. So Boris is not seen as being written off, you think? Is that possible?
I think he's a storyteller. He has what people sense an irrepressible belief, whether rational or not, that Britain is the best country on the planet. Not many people believe that. And if he believes it as sincerely as he does, take my word, he does, then you think that anything is possible. And then you actually have more of a sense of drive and ambition in government, which is, again, what people sense. Unfortunately, he was destroyed not by Keir Starmer, but by his own party. And that relationship was always a little bit toxic. It's now, I think, irreparable. If we had a presidential system, it'd be a different game. But for better or worse, I don't think there is the possibility or likelihood of Boris coming back. So my advice for the Conservative Party in the meantime, and some of them get this, is let Labour fight Farage over immigration. Let them slog at each other for the next couple of years until Labour either sort it or they leave, the keys to government, they hand them over to Nigel Farage. And in the meantime, just focus on what is long-term the bigger threat, that the British economy is, heading down a cul-de-sac. And if the Conservative Party day after day, week after week, was the voice of economic competence, and people like Andrew Griffiths, the Shadow Business Secretary, gets this. I get texts from him every morning pointing out to something that is alarming and suggesting something that may help. I think if the Conservative Party just concentrated on that, there would be a huge body of people, whether they're rich entrepreneurs, wealth creators, small businessmen, white van men and women and all the rest of it, and also just ordinary people who are more worried about the economy than anything else, who would start listening again. That's what I would do, not compete with Nigel Farage, particularly with a woman called Kemi Badenoch, on the basis of the answer to all our problems is to throw out foreigners.
Well, he's got Nadine Dorris now, so he can spend some time digesting her. Gitto Harry, thank you very much. Paul Mason, thank you very much. We will be watching this space. Thank you.